The wind that scraped across the hide walls of the teepee that January night carried with it the particular cruelty of high plains, winter a cold so complete it seemed capable of stopping the heart. Mid-beat. Inside, firelight threw restless shadows across two figures who sat close to the flames, not merely for warmth, but for the comfort that light brings to those who have stared too long into darkness. Kangji held the envelope with a gentleness that contradicted the violence written into every scar on his weathered hands. The paper had traveled farther than most men would journey in their lifetimes, passed through more hands than could be counted, and returned bearing a single purple stamp that shouted its verdict in bureaucratic finality, unclaimed. Beneath it, in the bored scrawl of some distant clerk, addressee unknown, returned to sender. Harriet Price watched his thumb trace the route the letter had taken following the postmarks, like a map of failure. Her own handwriting stared back at her from the front, Mrs. Winifred Cole, Mercury Falls, Dakota Territory. Each careful letter now mocking the hope she'd felt when writing them. Below, in smaller script that betrayed her desperation even then. Regarding placement of one orphan girl aged 10 years, answers urgently needed. If Mercury Falls never heard of her. Harriet's voice caught. She tried again, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. If they never heard the name, then Alice never... She couldn't finish. No, Kangji said. The single syllable fell like a stone into still water. She did not reach safety. She reached nowhere at all. Outside, a coyote's cry split the frozen night, lonesome, hungry searching. Inside, something colder than winter settled between them. They both understood what happened to children who vanished into the frontier's machinery. The territory swallowed people whole and rarely bothered to spit back even bones. Harriet's hands twisted in her lap. The postal system stamped her unclaimed, like damaged freight. Like she was never anyone's to begin with. Kangji tucked the envelope inside his buckskin shirt next to skin that bore the scars of 3 decades surviving on these plains. The system gave up, he said, and his voice carried the weight of a promise forming. I do not. She looked at him, then really looked, saw the lines carved into his face by wind and hardship and loss, saw the absolute certainty in eyes that had witnessed the slow death of his people's way of life, but refused to stop fighting. They'll kill us both, she said. Not a question, a simple statement of fact. A white woman and a Lakota man riding together, asking questions about missing children. Rock Creek alone will. Yes. He met her gaze without flinching. They will try, but I made a promise to that child. I keep my promises. Harriet nodded slowly. She'd spent 3 years teaching on this brutal edge, where 2 worlds ground against each other like millstones. 3 years watching the consequences of choosing sides. The envelope in his shirt represented a choice from which there could be no retreat. At first light, then, she said. At first light. The fire burned lower. Outside, the coyote called again, and this time, no answer came. In the silence that followed, Harriet thought about the girl they'd found 4 months earlier, half buried in the wreckage of an ambushed wagon, clutching a cracked doll, and staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much dying. It had been late September when Kangji found her, though the leaves had already turned, and the first hard frost had come to warn of the brutal winter ahead. He'd been riding alone, as he usually did those days, patrolling the unmarked boundary between the Lakota winter camp and the scattered white settlements that kept creeping westward like a slow-moving plague. The smoke had drawn him first, a black column rising into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Then came the crows circling in that particular pattern that meant fresh death. The freight wagon lay on its side in a shallow ravine still smoldering. 4 men sprawled in the dirt around it in positions that told their story clearly, ambush panic violence that had ended badly for everyone. Lakota arrows stood up from 2 bodies. Bullet holes decorated the others. The cargo had been thoroughly looted, though, whether by the attackers or later scavengers, Kangji couldn't tell. He was turning to leave. This was white man's trouble, and would bring only more trouble when he heard it. A sound so small he almost missed it beneath the wind's whisper and the crow's complaints. A whimper faint as a wounded rabbit's last breath. He found her wedged beneath a trunk that had fallen when the wagon overturned, half covered by torn canvas. 10 years old, maybe less hard to tell under the soot and terror. Her dress had been fine, once dark wool with proper buttons. Now it hung in tatters. Both hands clutched a porcelain doll whose painted face had cracked down the middle, splitting the smile into something grotesque. When Kangji knelt beside her, speaking low and soft in English, she didn't run or scream. She just stared at him with eyes the color of winter sky and asked a question in a voice scraped raw from smoke or screaming or both. "Are you going to scalp me?" Something in Kangji's chest twisted, not anger exactly. Something older and more tired than anger. "No, little one. I'm going to take you somewhere safe." Safe. She said the word like she was testing it, seeing if it still meant anything. Then she reached up with one trembling hand and took hold of his sleeve. He carried her to the mixed settlement near Rock Creek, to the one-room schoolhouse that sat precisely on the boundary line, because its teacher had insisted on serving both communities equally. Harriet Price had taken one look at the child's condition and pulled them both inside without asking a single question. That had been Harriet's way act, first ask questions only when the immediate crisis had passed. She washed the soot from the girl's pale hair, fed her thin soup, wrapped her in blankets by the iron stove. Only later, when the child had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, did Harriet turn to Kangji with questions in her eyes. "The wagon was white," he said simply. "The attack was complicated. Both sides lost people. She's the only survivor I've found." Harriet's jaw tightened. She understood what complicated meant on this frontier, how violence spiraled, how each side blamed the other, how children got caught in between. "What was her name?" Harriet asked. "She hasn't said. Won't speak about what happened before." The girl stayed silent for 3 days. Slept in the schoolhouse by night, but during the day, she followed Kangji like a shadow. When he worked with his horses, she held the brushes. When he sat by his fire, she sat close enough to touch the fringe on his shirt. She watched everything with those winter sky eyes and slowly learned the hand talk the Lakota used when words weren't needed. It was Harriet who finally coaxed the story out in fragments over weeks. The girl's name was Alice. Her parents had died of fever in St. Louis. An uncle had put her on a wagon heading west to California, paid her passage, promised to send for her when he had land. But the uncle's letter had never mentioned that the wagon master was a drunk, or that the route cut through contested territory, or that no one aboard had any real idea what they were riding into. Alice told the story without tears in a flat voice that made Harriet's heart ache worse than crying would have. Then she asked the question that haunted them all. "Where do I go now?" Kangji and Harriet both knew the answer before asking it. Nowhere good. A white orphan in a Lakota camp would bring the cavalry down with accusations of kidnapping. An unclaimed child in the white settlements would end up in one of the territorial orphanages that were really just workhouses where children died slowly of neglect and exhaustion. Harriet spent 3 weeks writing letters, making inquiries, calling in every favor she'd earned in 3 years of teaching. Finally, she found what seemed like an answer: Winifred Cole of Mercury Falls, a widow who took in girls and trained them for respectable work. The recommendation came from the Territorial Women's Aid Society. The letter Harriet received back spoke of a clean home, regular meals, education, and a future that didn't involve dying young in some factory or bordello. They told Alice about the plan on a morning when the first snow had fallen and winter was setting its teeth into the land. She listened without speaking, her small hands gripping the edge of Kanji's gun belt. "Will there be a garden?" she finally asked. "Yes," Harriet said gently, "with flowers, and your own bed, and other girls to talk to." Alice nodded, but her eyes sought Kanji's face. "You'll come if I need you." He knelt to her height, placed one calloused hand on her thin shoulder. "If you call, I ride, no matter how far, no matter what stands between. You remember that." The Rock Creek Depot smelled of coal smoke, horse dung, and the particular sharp scent of frontier desperation. Too many people with too few choices, trying to convince themselves that the next town and the next territory, the next broken promise, would finally deliver salvation. Harriet held tight to Alice's hand as they navigated the crowd. The girl had been scrubbed clean, her hair braided tight, a blue ribbon tied at the end that matched her eyes. She looked like any other child heading west to a better life. She looked like she might actually make it. "Stage is overbooked," the ticket clerk said when Harriet presented their papers. "Been a run on Mercury Falls ever since they struck silver up that way. Everyone wants in." Harriet's heart sank. "But I have confirmation. The letter from Mrs. Cole. Don't care what letters you got, lady. Coach is full." That's when Quentin Arno appeared. Later, Harriet would replay this moment 1,000 times, searching for the warning signs she'd missed. But in that crowded depot with Alice's small hands sweating in hers and the coach driver shouting final warnings, Quentin Arno had seemed like Providence itself. He was perhaps 40 with dark hair oiled and parted precisely, wearing a wool coat that cost more than Harriet earned in 6 months. Everything about him spoke of authority and respectability. The leather portfolio under his arm, the way he moved through the crowd, with easy confidence, the manner in which the Indian agent nodded to him, with clear recognition and approval. "Pardon me, Miss Price." His voice was educated Eastern. "I couldn't help but overhear your difficulty. I work with the Territorial Immigrant Bureau, facilitate placements, ensure proper care for orphans heading west. The Mercury Falls route is indeed overcrowded, but I happen to be escorting several young ladies to Broken Arrow today. Your Alice could travel with us that far, then transfer to the Mercury Falls coach tomorrow. No additional charge, just doing my Christian duty." He produced papers as he spoke, permits bearing territorial seals receipts from satisfied families, letters of recommendation with impressive signatures. The Indian agent caught Harriet's questioning glance and nodded again, more firmly. Quentin Arno was clearly a known quantity, a trusted facilitator. Harriet looked down at Alice. The girl's face had gone carefully blank, the expression she wore when trying not to show fear. But the coach was leaving, and Mercury Falls was weeks away, by any other route. And Winifred Cole's letter had emphasized that the placement was time-sensitive. "I'll take excellent care of her," Quentin said, and his smile never wavered. Alice climbed into the coach. Harriet had tied that blue ribbon herself that morning, fingers trembling slightly as she worked. Now she watched it disappear into the coach's dim interior. Kanji had come to see them off, despite the hostile stares his presence drew. He stood beside Harriet as the coach pulled away, and when Alice leaned out the window for one last look, he raised his hand in the sign that meant safe journey. Alice's hand came up in return, copying the gesture he'd taught her. Then the dust swallowed everything. "She will be all right," Harriet said, needing to believe it, needing to hear it said aloud. Kanji said nothing. His eyes stayed on the dust cloud long after the sound of the wheels had faded. 2 months. In 2 months, winter set in with a vengeance that killed the old and the weak and the unprepared. In 2 months, the Lakota camp moved to lower ground, and white settlers battened down against the cold, and the world contracted to the distance between warm fires. In 2 months, no letter came from Alice. Harriet told herself it was the weather. Mail moved slowly, when snow closed the passes. The territorial post was notoriously unreliable. Winifred Cole was probably too busy with holiday preparations to write immediately. She told herself these lies and tried to believe them. Then the envelope arrived, and all the lies fell away. The purple stamp seemed to pulse with malevolence, unclaimed. The clerk's note was even worse in its casual dismissal, addressee unknown, returned to sender. Harriet stared at the envelope for a full minute before her hand stopped shaking enough to open it. Inside was her own letter unread. The seal she'd so carefully placed had never been broken. The paper she'd agonized over, trying to get every detail right, had never been read by its intended recipient. Alice's name appeared nowhere in any official record. No placement had been registered. No arrival had been noted. Winifred Cole, if she existed at all, had never heard of a 10-year-old girl with winter sky eyes and a blue ribbon in her hair. Harriet walked to the Lakota camp through snow that came up to her knees. She didn't feel the cold, didn't hear the whispers that followed her, the white woman who'd lost her mind and her reputation, both walking alone to the savage camp in weather that could kill. Kangi emerged from his teepee before she could call out. He took one look at her face and knew. They sat by his fire while she told him everything. He listened without interrupting his expression, giving away nothing. When she finally fell silent and handed him the envelope, he studied it for a long time. "This was deliberate," he said at last. "What do you mean? Look." He pointed to the postmarks. "This went to Mercury Falls. The clerk there stamped it unclaimed. But look at this second stamp. It went through the territorial office in the capital first. Someone there should have questioned why a letter to a registered widow was being returned unclaimed. Someone should have investigated." Harriet's blood went cold. "You think?" "I think Alice never reached Mercury Falls because she was never meant to reach Mercury Falls." Kangi set the envelope down carefully, as if it might bite. "I think we were very carefully played. But the papers, the recommendations, the Indian agent knew him." "Yes." Kangi's voice had gone flat. "Dangerous. The Indian agent knew him, which means this goes higher than one smooth-talking man at a depot." Harriet wrapped her arms around herself, though the cold she felt had nothing to do with winter. "We have to find her?" "Yes." "They'll try to stop us?" "Yes." "Rock Creek alone will—" She stopped, took a breath, started again, her voice steadier. "They'll make it impossible. A white woman and a Lakota man traveling together, asking questions about missing children. We'll be arrested before we get 10 miles. Kangi looked at her across the fire. "You don't have to come. Don't be a fool." The profanity startled them both. Harriet rarely swore. That child trusted us. We put her on that coach. We're going to find her. He smiled then, just slightly. "At first light." "At first light," she agreed. Outside the teepee, the wind howled its approval or its warning. Inside, they began to plan. They rode into Rock Creek at dawn, and the town's reaction was immediate and ugly. Conversation stopped mid-word. Doors closed. A woman on a porch actually spat at Harriet as they passed, a deliberate theatrical gesture of disgust that left a wet mark on Harriet's skirt. At the post office, the clerk looked at Kangi's braids and buckskin and barely contained his sneer. "Help you?" The question was directed solely at Harriet, as if Kangi didn't exist. Harriet laid the envelope on the counter. "This was sent from here. I need to know why it was returned unclaimed." The clerk didn't even glance at it. "Address didn't match. Happens all the time. Not our problem." "It's a federal offense to interfere with the mail," Harriet said, keeping her voice level. "You accusing me of something?" The clerk's face flushed. "Because I don't take kindly The lady asked a question. Kanji's voice was quiet, but it cut through the clerk's bluster like a knife through butter. The clerk's flush deepened, but now it was anger mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps, or just the reflexive hatred that came from being challenged by someone he considered subhuman. "You got no business in here, Redskin. Town ordinance says, I know what it says." Sheriff Heavy Hank filled the doorway, his gut straining against his gun belt. "Natives in town, limits only with white escort and only for necessary business." His piggy eyes fixed on Harriet. "This your business school, marm, or you just making trouble where trouble ain't needed?" Harriet's jaw tightened. "We're asking about a missing child. A white girl, 10 years old, last seen boarding a coach from this depot. Surely that qualifies as necessary." Something flickered in Heavy Hank's face, not quite recognition, but close. Too close. "Missing girl, you say, and you bring an Indian to help you look." He shook his head slowly. "That's real touching. Now ask your questions quick and move along before decent folks start getting nervous." They got nothing from the post office except hostile stares. Outside, Harriet tried the depot office. While Kanji waited with the horses, his mere presence would have shut down any conversation before it started. The depot manager, a balding man named Declan, remembered the day. "Sure, I saw Arno escort a girl onto the night coach. Paid extra for inside seats, said she was nervous about the trip. Seemed like a kind gesture." "Do you have a record of her ticket?" Declan shifted uncomfortably. "Well, now that's the thing. Arno's passengers sometimes don't make it into the official books. He pays cash, handles his own arrangements. We trust him. He's placed dozens of orphans and immigrants over the years." "Placed them where?" Harriet's voice had gone cold. "That's his business, ma'am, not mine." She left before her anger could get her thrown out. Found Kanji by the horses, both of them drawing stares from every passing citizen. A group of men had gathered across the street, talking in low voices and shooting hostile glances their direction. "We need to get out of town," Harriet said quietly. "But first," she glanced at the telegraph office. "There's someone I need to try." The telegraph operator was a thin, nervous man called Sam. Harriet had sent messages through him before, and always gotten the sense he disapproved of something, her, the town, his own life. She'd never quite figured out which. Now she found him hunched over his key jumping when she entered. "Need to send a message," Harriet said. Sam's eyes darted to the window, checking if anyone was watching. "Make it quick." While she composed her telegram, a carefully worded inquiry to the Territorial Women's Aid Society about Winifred Cole. Sam's fingers tapped out the message. Then they kept tapping, but different, not the rhythm of the message Harriet had given him. "What are you—" she started. "Quiet." Sam's voice was barely a whisper. He kept tapping, his fingers flying. Then he ripped off a piece of paper and shoved it at her. "Read this later." "Not here. Not now. Just go." Harriet took the paper and left. She didn't read it until they were a mile out of Rock Creek, hidden in a stand of cottonwoods. Kanji watched the road while she unfolded the paper. "Arno keeps a ledger. Real records. Telegraph safe back wall. Guard plays cards at saloon every night. If you want the truth, you'll have to steal it." Harriet showed the note to Kanji. He read it twice, his face unreadable. "It's a trap," he said finally. "Maybe. Probably." "Probably," she agreed. "But if there's a ledger, if there are real records, that's evidence. That's something the law would have to acknowledge. The law here answers to men like Arno, not the territorial judge. Holt's honest, everyone says so." Kanji gave her a look. "Everyone said Arno was honest, too." That landed like a fist. Harriet closed her eyes, remembering how she'd checked Arno's credentials, how carefully she'd verified everything before trusting him with Alice. How blind she'd been. "We have to try," she said. Kangji studied the note again, then the road, then her face. Whatever he saw there made his expression soften slightly. "All right, but we do it my way. And if it goes wrong, it won't. If it goes wrong," he continued firmly, "you run. Don't wait for me. Don't try to fight. Just run. I'm not leaving you. Harriet." He said her name with such gentle finality that her protest died. "If we both die, Alice stays lost. If you live, you can keep looking. Promise me." She wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but he was right and they both knew it. "I promise." "Liar," he said almost fondly, "but I'll take it." They waited until full dark, until the town had settled into its nighttime rhythms, drunks in the saloons, respectable citizens, behind locked doors, only a few late stragglers on the streets. Harriet went alone. Kangji had wanted to come, but they both knew his presence would draw too much attention. Instead, he positioned himself near the saloon where the guard played cards, ready to cause a distraction if needed. The rear window of the telegraph office had been left unlatched just as Sam's note had promised. Harriet climbed through with her heart hammering so hard she was certain the whole town could hear it. Inside darkness was absolute. She stood frozen, letting her eyes adjust, listening for any sound that might indicate she wasn't alone. Nothing but her own breathing and the distant sounds of nighttime Rock Creek. The safe was exactly where Sam had said it would be, bolted to the back wall, squat and heavy. Harriet knelt before it, her hands shaking, and tried the combination Sam had given her in a second, even more dangerous conversation earlier that evening. The lock clicked open on the third try. Inside, beneath papers and coin bags, lay a leather-bound ledger. Harriet lifted it out with trembling hands and carried it to the window where moonlight gave just enough illumination to read. She opened to a random page and felt her blood turn to ice. Names, ages, descriptions, destinations, prices. The ledger was a catalog of human merchandise. Children sold like livestock with tidy columns, noting their physical characteristics, where they'd been sent and what they'd fetched. Some destinations she recognized: mining camps, railroad construction sites, places where cheap labor was always needed, and where a child could disappear without anyone asking questions. Halfway down one page she found it: Alice, 10 years, fair blue eyes, broken wheel mine, $45. The numbers swam. $45. That's what a 10-year-old girl was worth in Quentin Arno's economy. $45 and a blue ribbon. Harriet closed the ledger before she could see any more. Later she would read it thoroughly, would memorize every name and destination. But right now, she needed to move before her shaking hands dropped everything. She was halfway to the window when she heard voices outside. "Saw someone climb in the back." "You sure? Probably just a cat." "I know what I saw. Go get the sheriff." Harriet's heart stopped. She looked at the window, calculated the distance, knew she'd never make it before. Whoever was coming reached the door. She looked at the ledger in her hands and made a choice. She shoved the ledger under her coat and moved to the front of the office to the main door. Took a deep breath, opened it, and walked out into the street like she had every right to be there. The men who'd been talking stopped and stared. "Evening," Harriet said calmly, as if she regularly walked out of closed telegraph offices after dark. "Just checking on a message I sent earlier." One of the men, a drunk with whiskey on his breath, squinted at her. "Office is closed, lady. What were you really—" That's when Kangji appeared from the shadows. He didn't say anything, didn't threaten, just stepped into view with his hand near his knife. The drunk's words dried up mid-sentence. "We should go," Harriet said quietly. They walked to where they'd hidden the horses, moving at a normal pace, despite every instinct screaming to run. Behind them, she heard the drunk calling for the sheriff, heard doors opening, heard the town starting to wake up and take notice. They were half a mile out when they heard the pursuit starting. "Ride," Kanji said, and this time Harriet didn't argue. They made camp in a dry wash 5 miles from Rock Creek, with no fire and taking turns on watch. At first light, they'd examined the ledger properly. For now, they just needed to survive the night. Harriet couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those columns of names, saw Alice's entry, saw all the other children listed like inventory. "We should go back," she said during Kanji's watch. "For Sam. He helped us. If they figure out it was him." "They already have," Kanji said quietly. "Or they will soon. The question is whether he knew that when he helped us." The words sat heavy between them. Sam had known the risk, had helped anyway, and they'd taken his help and ridden away. "We can't save everyone," Kanji said, reading her thoughts. "We can't even save most people. We can maybe save Alice. Maybe. That has to be enough." "Does it?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. At dawn, they studied the ledger properly. Page after page of transactions spanning 3 years. Names they recognized: other orphans who'd passed through Rock Creek, children from the reservation who'd vanished after being placed in service, runaways and cast-offs, and anyone vulnerable enough to be taken. Most destinations were mines or railroad camps or remote ranches, where labor was cheap and questions were scarce. A few entries had been crossed out with a single word beside them: deceased. Harriet found herself cataloging the dead, matching names to children she'd taught or seen around town. The Morrison girl who'd supposedly gone to a good family in Rapid City. The Thompson boy who'd been sent to work on the railroad. The half-breed twins who'd vanished from the reservation one night. All dead. All noted with the same clinical detachment as a shopkeeper marking spoiled goods. "We need to get this to Judge Holt," Harriet said. "This is evidence. Real evidence. He can't ignore. He can ignore whatever he wants." Kanji interrupted. "He can say the ledger was stolen, that we forged it, that it's not admissible. And while he's saying all that, Arno will be warned, and the children will be moved or killed. So what do we do?" Kanji closed the ledger carefully. "We go to Broken Wheel Mine, we get Alice out, then we bring this to Holt. And if Alice isn't there anymore, then we follow the trail until we find her. Simple, impossible, the only plan they had." They were saddling the horses when they saw the rider approaching. Just one man riding hard, pushing his horse beyond what was safe. It was Sam. He pulled up 50 yards away, swaying in his saddle. Even at that distance, Harriet could see blood on his shirt. "Don't come closer," he called out. His voice was wrong, wet, bubbling. "They're right behind me. Maybe 5 minutes. I just had to..." He coughed and more blood came up. "Had to warn you. They know about the ledger. They know you're heading for Broken Wheel." "Get down," Harriet said, already moving toward him. "Let me help." "No time." Sam was fading, listing sideways. "They'll kill you too. They'll..." His eyes found Kanji. "There's more records. Telegraph office under the key itself. Copies I made. Dates, names, everything. If I don't make it back..." He didn't finish. Just slowly folded and fell from his saddle. They reached him together. Harriet turned him over gently while Kanji kept watch on the trail behind. Sam's shirt was soaked through multiple stab wounds done professionally. Someone who knew where to cut to make death slow and painful. "Why?" Harriet asked, cradling his head. "Why help us?" Sam's eyes were already glazing. "Because I got a daughter," he whispered. Had a daughter. She was in that ledger too. His hand found Harriet's wrist, gripped with surprising strength. Find them. Find all of them. Don't let the devils. He died before he could finish. Kanji was already urging Harriet to move. We can't stay. They're coming. We can't just leave him. He died to warn us. Don't waste it. Harriet looked at Sam's body, at his slack face and empty eyes, at the blood soaking into the dry earth. Then she stood and followed Kanji to the horses. They rode hard, pushing the animals to their limits, racing ahead of pursuit that never quite caught up but never quite fell behind either. Behind them, they heard shots, someone finding Sam's body maybe, or just shooting at shadows. That night, camped in a rocky outcrop that offered some protection, Harriet finally opened the ledger again. In the margin of one page, she found a notation in different handwriting than Arno's careful script, SM, paid in full. Disposed per QA instruction, SM Sam Morrison. Paid in full meaning his daughter had been sold. Disposed per instruction, meaning she was dead. He knew, Harriet said. Sam knew his daughter was dead, and he helped us anyway. Kangi added a small stick to their meager fire. He helped us because he knew. His daughter was gone, but Alice might not be. That's why dying men do brave things, because they have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Did he prove it? Yes, Kanji said firmly. He proved that even in a place this corrupt, some people still choose right over easy. That has to count for something. Harriet hoped he was correct. But as she lay in her bedroll that night, listening to coyotes singing in the darkness, she couldn't shake the image of Sam's body lying in the dust while they rode away. They'd saved the ledger. They'd saved themselves. But they hadn't saved Sam. In the end, maybe that was all the frontier ever offered: partial victories and complete regrets, all mixed together until you couldn't tell which was which anymore. Part 8. Broken Wheel. The trail to Broken Wheel Mine climbed through country that seemed designed specifically to kill the unwary. Narrow paths carved into cliff faces. Loose shale that could give way without warning. Ravines that dropped into darkness deep enough to swallow screams. They picked up Dr. Joseph Yale in Blackthorn, a worn-down sawbones who'd been treating girls from the mine for 2 years and hating himself for it every single time. I knew, he said when they showed him the ledger. I knew, and I did nothing. Just patched them up and sent them back. You're coming now, Harriet said. It wasn't a question. Joseph looked at his clean, empty surgery, at the hands he'd used to heal instead of harm. Yes, he said. I'm coming now. On the second day up the mountain, Harriet's horse slipped. She went down hard, her shoulders slamming into rock with a sound that made Kanji's teeth ache in sympathy. The joint didn't break, but something tore. He could see it in how she held herself afterward, careful compensating, trying not to show pain. He fashioned a sling from strips cut from his own shirt, working with quick efficiency, while Dr. Joseph watched and occasionally grunted approval. Can you shoot? Kanji asked when he finished. Harriet picked up her carbine, one-handed, settled it against her good shoulder, sighted down the barrel. Her face went white, but her hands stayed steady. If I have to. You'll have to. They reached Broken Wheel at dusk. The mine sat in a box canyon with only one way in or out, perfect for defense, terrible for escape. The main entrance gaped in the cliff face, shored up with timbers that looked half-rotten. Several ore carts sat rusted on warped rails. A bunkhouse squatted nearby, smoke rising from its chimney. The silence was wrong. Mines were never silent. There was always the sound of picks, of voices of machinery. This was the silence of a trap waiting to spring. They know we're here, Kanji said. Yes. Harriet checked her carbine again. What do? We spring the trap. but carefully. They'd barely started forward when the rifles opened up from the ridges. Stone exploded around them. Dr. Joseph's horse screamed and bolted. Harriet's mare reared. Kanji threw himself sideways, dragging Harriet with him behind an overturned ore cart that provided minimal cover. A bullet took Dr. Joseph in the leg, not a graze, a solid hit that shattered bone. He went down with a shout that cut through the gunfire. Kanji low-crawled to him, grabbed his coat, hauled him back to the cart, while bullets spanged off iron and kicked up dirt all around. How many? Harriet gasped, pressed flat against the ground. Kanji risked a look. 4 on the north ridge, 2 south, maybe more in the mine. We're pinned. Yes. A voice echoed from the mine entrance. Quentin Arno's voice, smooth and cultured, even while orchestrating murder. Kangi, I'm impressed you made it this far. But it ends now. Come out with your hands up or I start killing children. You have 60 seconds? 60? 59. Harriet looked at Kanji, saw the calculation in his eyes. Saw him weighing his life against Alice's. Saw him starting to stand. She grabbed his arm. Wait, look. She pointed up the canyon wall. Above the mine entrance, an old ore cart sat on rails that led downward. Broken Wheel had clearly been using it to haul waste up and dump it, but the rails looked warped and the cart was overloaded, held in place by a timber wedged under the wheels. 45. 44. If that cart comes down. Harriet started. The entrance might collapse. Kangi finished. But Alice is in there. Arno's in there too. And his men. If they're buried, Alice gets buried with them. 30, 29. Harriet's mind raced. The cart was too far for her to shoot. Her shoulder wouldn't take the recoil, and the angle was impossible. But Kanji could make the shot. Probably. Maybe. Or they could surrender and hope Arno kept his word. Hope he'd let them trade themselves for Alice. Hope a man who sold children for $45 each had enough honor to honor a deal. 20. 19? Dr. Joseph, bleeding and pale, grabbed Harriet's hand. The cart, he gasped. Hit the cart. Trust the timbers, they're designed to collapse inward. Save most of the tunnel. Just block the entrance. 10. 9. You sure? Harriet demanded. No, Joseph admitted. But I'm dying anyway. Let it mean something. Kanji was already moving, positioning himself for the shot. The cart was small in his sights, and the timber under it even smaller. He'd have one chance. If he missed, Arno would execute Alice, and they'd all die here. 5. 4. Kanji exhaled slowly, found that place of absolute stillness between heartbeats. 3. 2. He fired. The timber exploded into splinters. For one suspended moment, nothing happened. Then the cart lurched forward with a shriek of tortured metal. The cart accelerated down the rails, tons of rock and iron, picking up speed. The shooters on the ridges stopped firing, watching in horror as the cart barreled toward the mine entrance. It hit the support timbers like the fist of an angry god. Wood screamed. The entrance sagged. Then, exactly as Dr. Joseph had predicted, the engineered collapse began, timbers falling inward in controlled sequence, blocking the entrance, but leaving the main tunnel structure intact. Except nothing was ever controlled in moments like this. The collapse triggered a secondary failure. The riddled old timbers couldn't handle the sudden stress. The entire front section of the mine came down in a roar of rock and dust and screaming wood. Kangi didn't think. He ran straight into the collapsing entrance, ducking under falling rock, his eyes streaming from dust. He saw Arno, saw the man's gun, pointed at a small figure in torn dress. Saw the muzzle flash. Then the world turned to darkness and falling stone, and the certain knowledge that he'd just killed them all, trying to save them. The darkness inside the collapsing mine was absolute and alive, a living thing made of choking dust and falling stone, and the screams of men who understood too late that their trap had closed on them instead. Kangji couldn't see, could barely breathe. But he'd seen where Alice was standing before the world turned black, and he moved toward that spot on pure instinct, his hands outstretched, ducking under timber that groaned overhead like dying animals. His fingers found fabric, small arms. He grabbed and rolled, pulling the child with him toward where memory insisted the bunkhouse wall had been. Rocks slammed down where they'd been standing a heartbeat before. They hit the outside wall together, Kangji's body wrapped around Alice's, and stayed there while the mountain finished its rage. Dust filled everything, lungs, eyes, the spaces between thoughts. Time became meaningless. There was only the need to cover this small body and wait for the thunder to stop. When silence finally came, it was worse than the noise had been. Kangji coughed, tasted blood, and Dust coughed again. Beneath him, Alice was moving, which meant alive. He eased his weight off her carefully, his back screaming where falling rock had torn through his shirt and the skin beneath. "Can you breathe?" His voice came out as a croak. A small, choked sob answered him. Then, "Kange." "I'm here, little one. I'm here." The dust was settling enough to see shapes now, the bunkhouse wall they'd fetched up against the massive pile of rock and shattered timber that had been the mine entrance, the canyon beyond, where Harriet was screaming his name. "Here," he called back. "We're here." Harriet appeared from behind the ore cart, like something conjured from smoke, her face white with dust, except for the tracks tears had carved through it. She saw them against the wall, and her legs nearly gave out. Behind her, Dr. Joseph was trying to stand despite the blood pooling under his shattered leg. Trying and failing and trying again with the stubbornness of a man who knows he's dying, but refuses to lie down for it. The shooting had stopped. The men on the ridges had either fled or were picking their way down, no longer interested in killing people who might be the only ones who could dig them out if they ended up trapped. But from inside the collapsed mine came sounds that made Harriet's blood freeze, muffled shouts. Fists pounding on stone, the desperate scrabbling of men buried alive. "How long do they have?" she asked Joseph as she helped him back to the ground. The doctor's face was gray. "In that dust, with that many men using up the air, maybe an hour if the collapse sealed them in tight. Maybe minutes if there's another cave-in." "Good," Harriet said flatly and meant it. Joseph looked at her with something like respect. "You've changed since I met you, Miss Price." "No," she corrected. "I just stopped pretending the world was anything other than what it is." Kangji carried Alice to where they could see her in better light. She was thin, dangerously thin, and bruised in ways that made his jaw clench. But she was breathing and conscious, and when she looked at him, her eyes were still that winter sky blue he remembered. "You came?" she whispered. "I said I would ride if you called. I heard you calling." "I didn't, though. I never got to send a letter or anything. How did you—" "You called," he repeated firmly. "I heard." Harriet was examining Alice with gentle hands, checking for injuries beyond the obvious ones. A badly bruised wrist, probably from shackles. Cuts on her feet from walking without proper shoes. The kind of systematic neglect that came from viewing children as disposable resources. "There are others," Alice said, suddenly grabbing Harriet's sleeve. "In the back tunnels. 3 girls, maybe more. They moved us when they heard you were coming. Please." From the collapsed entrance came a sound like grinding teeth, rocks settling, the pile shifting. Then a hand emerged from a gap in the rubble, pale and reaching. Kangji moved toward it instinctively. Found himself looking at Quentin Arno's face through a narrow opening in the fallen stone. Blood-streaked, terrified, all the smooth charm stripped away to show the desperate animal beneath. Help me, Arno gasped. Please, I'll tell you everything. I'll testify. Just get me out. Kengi stared at him for a long moment. Behind him, he could feel Harriet and Alice watching. Could feel the weight of the choice pressing down like those tons of rock. How many children? He asked quietly. What? How many children have you sold in the last 3 years? The ledger says 97. Is that all of them? Arno's eyes darted, calculating even now. I can't, the records aren't. How many are dead? That's not fair. I placed them in jobs, legitimate work. If some couldn't handle... How many? Kengi's voice hadn't risen, but something in it made Arno flinch. I don't know, 50, 60? How am I supposed to keep track of... Kengi stood, turned away. Wait. Arno's voice climbed toward panic. You can't just leave me. I'm a white man. I have rights, you Indian devil. You can't... Kengi kept walking. Behind him, Arno's curses turned to pleas, turned to screams, as the rock pile settled again and the gap closed. The screaming went on for a long time. Then it didn't. We need to find the others, Harriet said quietly. She wasn't looking at the collapsed mine, wasn't acknowledging what had just happened. Maybe couldn't afford to, not yet. The back entrance to Broken Wheel turned out to be less a proper tunnel and more a crack in the rock face too narrow for ore carts, but wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he didn't mind tight spaces and the possibility of getting stuck. Kengi went in first, with a lantern moving slowly, his broad shoulders scraping stone on both sides. The tunnel opened up after 20 feet into a natural cave that the mine had incorporated into their operation. He found them in the deepest part, 3 girls huddled in a space barely large enough for them to sit, their ankles chained to a bolt driven into solid rock. They cringed when his light found them throwing up skeletal arms to ward off blows they expected. I'm not going to hurt you, Kengi said in his gentlest voice. I'm going to get you out. The oldest, maybe 12, stared at him with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. Are you real, or are we dead? I'm real. My name is Kengi. I came with a teacher named Miss Price. We're taking you home. Home, the girl repeated like she was testing whether the words still meant anything. We don't have homes. Mo. Then we'll find you some, Kengi said, and set about breaking the chains with a piece of timber that served as lever. By the time they got all 3 girls out, plus 2 more, they found in an adjoining chamber and a boy of maybe 8 who was too weak to walk, and the sun was setting, and Dr. Joseph had stopped trying to pretend he wasn't dying. Harriet sat with him while Kengi organized the children, got them water, wrapped them in blankets scavenged from the bunkhouse. Joseph's breathing had gone shallow and wet. I should have done something sooner, he said, not to Harriet specifically, just saying it to whatever might be listening. I knew. I've known for 2 years. But I told myself I couldn't fight the whole system alone. You're not alone now, Harriet said. Joseph's laugh turned into a cough that brought up blood. Now I'm dying. Very brave of me helping once I had nothing left to lose. You're helping. That's what matters. Is it? His eyes found hers. Sam helped too. Where is he? Harriet's throat closed. She'd been trying not to think about Sam's body lying in the dust, growing cold while they rode away. He didn't make it. None of us make it in the end, Miss Price. The question is what we do with the time we have. He fumbled for her hand. The territorial capital. Judge Morrison, he's honest. Show him the ledger. Make sure... He coughed again, harder. Make sure this meant something. It meant everything, Harriet said fiercely. You saved these children. You're a hero. Heroes don't take 2 years to find their courage. But he smiled slightly. though I suppose late is better than never. He died as the last light left the canyon, his hand still in Harriet's. She closed his eyes and sat with him until Kanji came to tell her it was time to move. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare of logistics and pain. 7 traumatized children who could barely walk. A dead man who deserved better than being left for the crows. Horses that were exhausted and supplies that had run out days ago. They moved in slow stages, making camp early when the children couldn't go further. Kanji and Harriet took turns carrying the youngest ones. Alice stayed close to Kanji, always her hand fisted in his belt, as if she feared that looking away might make him disappear. It took 5 days to reach Blackthorn. By then, word had spread. The territorial marshal was waiting with a dozen deputies and expressions that suggested they weren't sure whether to arrest the survivors or give them medals. Harriet didn't give them time to decide. She walked straight to the marshal's office and laid the ledger on his desk. "Read it," she said. "All of it. Then tell me again that we don't have problems with how orphans and native children disappear in this territory." The marshal, a gray-haired man named Collins, who'd seen enough frontier justice to be thoroughly cynical about the whole enterprise, opened the ledger, read one page, then another. His face went through several colors before settling on a kind of sick gray. "Sweet, merciful Christ," he muttered. Then looking up at Harriet, "Where did you get this? Does it matter? It might matter to a judge trying to determine admissibility of." "We stole it from a telegraph office safe in Rock Creek," Harriet interrupted. "A man named Sam Morrison helped us. They killed him for it. Now you can either use that ledger to shut down the whole rotten system, or you can worry about proper procedure while more children disappear. Your choice, Marshal." Collins looked at the ledger again, at the names and prices, at the column marked "Deceased" that ran to 3 pages. "Judge Holt's coming through next week for the circuit court. I'll make sure he sees this. But Miss Price," he hesitated, "you need to understand. The people involved in this, they have connections, money. They're not going to go down without a fight." "Good," Harriet said with a smile that would have terrified her students back in Rock Creek. "Neither am I." Judge Abner Holt arrived in Rock Creek 6 days later to find the town in an uproar. Word of the ledger had leaked, possibly because Marshal Collins had made sure it leaked, and suddenly everyone had opinions about corruption they'd happily ignored for years. The hearing was held in the largest venue available, the saloon with tables pushed aside and benches hauled in from the church. Every seat filled within minutes. People stood in the back, pressed against walls, craned their necks to see. Harriet stood at the front with the ledger open before her, Kanji beside her, despite the hostile stares his presence drew. Behind them sat Alice and the 6 other children from Broken Wheel, each one a living witness to what the ledger documented. Holt, to his credit, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Miss Price, I'm told you have evidence of systematic criminal activity involving the placement of orphaned and native children." "Yes, Your Honor." Harriet's voice carried to the back of the room. "This ledger documents the sale of 97 children over 3 years. It includes names, ages, prices paid, and destinations. It also includes a column noting which children died in placement." A murmur ran through the crowd. Holt raised a hand for silence. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have corroborating evidence beyond this book?" "We have 7 survivors who can testify to their treatment. We have Dr. Joseph Yale's statement taken before he died from injuries sustained during their rescue. We have the testimony of a telegraph operator named Sam Morrison. Morrison's dead." Sheriff Heavy Hank interrupted from where he sat in the front row. "Killed himself out of guilt when his involvement in this scheme came to light." Harriet's eyes went cold. "Sam Morrison was murdered for helping us obtain this ledger. His daughter's name appears on page 47, sold to a railroad camp 2 years ago, listed as deceased 6 months later. He helped us because he wanted justice for her and for every other child whose life was worth $45 to the men who sold them. The murmur grew louder. Holt banged his gavel. "Sheriff, you'll have your turn to testify." Miss Price, continue. Harriet walked the court through the ledger entry by entry, letting the numbers speak for themselves. 97 children. 43 listed as deceased. Destinations ranging from mines to construction camps to private residences. That everyone understood meant brothels. Then she called Alice to testify. The girl stood small and pale before the packed room, her hand white-knuckled on the edge of the witness stand. Holt's voice gentled when he addressed her. "Miss Alice, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell us in your own words what happened after you left Rock Creek." Alice's voice started so quiet they had to strain to hear. But as she spoke, it grew stronger. She told them about Quentin Arno's smile, how kind he'd seemed at first. About the coach ride that should have gone to Mercury Falls, but instead went to a way station where she and 3 other children were transferred to a freight wagon. About the chains, about the mine, the work, the cold, the men who came to look at them like they were cattle for purchase. I kept waiting. Alice said, her eyes finding Kangi in the crowd. I kept waiting because he said he'd ride if I called. And he did. He came even though I never got to send a letter. He heard me anyway. By the time she finished, half the women in the room were crying openly. Several men looked ready to dig up Arno's body just to kill him again. Holt called witness after witness. The other children from Broken Wheel each adding their piece to the damning mosaic. Marshal Collins presenting evidence his deputies had gathered. A banker from Rapid City who could trace money flowing from the mines back to accounts in Rock Creek. Finally, inevitably, he called Sheriff Heavy Hank. The sheriff took the stand with all his bluster intact, denying everything, claiming the ledger was forged, insisting that Arno had been a respected businessman, and any accusations against him were slander. Then Holt asked the question that broke him. "Sheriff, can you explain why you made 3 deposits of $100 each into your personal bank account in the 6 months following entries in this ledger that document children sent to locations within your jurisdiction?" The silence that followed was absolute. Heavy Hank tried to bluster, tried to explain, tried everything except tell the truth. But the numbers didn't lie, and in the end, neither did his face. They arrested him on the spot, arrested the Indian agent, arrested 4 prominent businessmen whose names appeared too often in the ledger's margins. Others, warned by friends, fled town before warrants could be issued. Holt closed the hearing near midnight, his voice heavy with exhaustion and disgust. This court finds sufficient evidence of systematic criminal conspiracy in the trafficking of children. All defendants will be held pending trial. Furthermore, I am ordering a territorial investigation into placement practices across all counties. If this rot runs as deep as I suspect, we'll tear it out root and branch or die trying. He brought down his gavel one final time. These children deserve better than what we've given them. God help us all. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it came with a vengeance. Wildflowers erupting across the prairie trees, budding overnight, the world shaking off winter's grip and remembering how to grow. The school that rose on the border between the Lakota camp and Rock Creek settlement was built by hands from both communities. Lakota men who knew timber, white carpenters who knew angles, children from both sides who carried water and watched the adults work side by side and slowly, carefully began talking to each other. Harriet stood in the doorway on opening day, watching students file in white Lakota and combinations thereof that the old world would have rejected, but this new one, this fragile growing thing, welcomed. Alice was among them, her hair braided in the Lakota style she'd learned from Kanji's sister, a blue ribbon still tied at the end, because some things were worth keeping. She sat between a Lakota girl named Winona and a white boy named Thomas, and when they bent over their slates together, Harriet felt something in her chest loosen. Not everything was fixed, not by a long measure. The territorial investigation had revealed corruption far deeper than even the ledger suggested. Trials would drag on for years. Children were still missing, still being exploited, still falling through cracks in a system that valued them at $45 each. But 7 children weren't. 7 children sat in that schoolhouse, learning to read and write and maybe eventually trust again. Kanji found Harriet, after the first day's lessons ended, standing by the fence he'd helped build, watching the sun set over land that had tried so hard to kill them both. "Alice wants to stay," he said without preamble. "With us. Not with a white family in Rapid City or a proper home with lace curtains. With us." Harriet had known this was coming, had spent weeks trying to decide how to feel about it. People will talk. People already talk. She'd have more opportunities. She'd have different opportunities, Kanji corrected. Not necessarily better ones. Harriet turned to face him. "You want her to stay." "I want her to be safe. If that means going to a nice white family who'll teach her proper manners and marry her off to some clerk, then that's what she should do." He paused. "But yes, I want her to stay." "So do I," Harriet admitted. "Is that selfish?" "Probably." His mouth quirked slightly. "But we saved her life. Maybe we've earned a little selfishness." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light paint the prairie gold. Somewhere in the settlement, someone was cooking dinner. The smell of frying meat drifted on the evening air. From the Lakota camp came the sound of singing traditional songs in a language Harriet was slowly learning. "What do we do about the letter?" she asked suddenly. Kanji pulled the unclaimed envelope from his shirt. He'd carried it every day since they left his teepee that cold January night. The purple stamp had faded, but the words remained addressee unknown. "Return to sender." "We keep it," he said, as a reminder. "Of what?" He looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "That sometimes the person it's meant for finds it anyway, even when the world tries its best to lose it." The letter had been addressed to Winifred Cole, requesting placement for one orphan girl. It had come back unclaimed, returned to sender, a bureaucratic failure that should have been the end of the story. Instead, it had been the beginning, the proof they needed. The thing that made them search when searching seemed impossible. Return to sender, back to the people who cared enough to keep looking. "I think," Harriet said slowly, "that we should show it to Alice. Let her decide what it means." They found her in the schoolhouse, helping clean slates for tomorrow's lessons. When they showed her the envelope, she studied it for a long time, her finger tracing the unclaimed stamp. "This is why you came looking," she said finally. "Because the letter came back wrong." "Yes," Harriet said. Alice looked between them, the Lakota warrior who'd taught her hand talk and how to read trail signs, the white teacher who'd spent hours teaching her proper English and manners. 2 people from different worlds who'd risked everything to find her. "Can I keep it?" she asked. "It's yours," Kanji said. "It always was." Alice folded the envelope carefully and tucked it in her pocket. "I'm glad it came back wrong," she said. "I'm glad it brought you looking. Is that bad?" "No," Harriet said firmly. "That's just being human." Outside, full dark had fallen. Inside the schoolhouse, lamplight pushed back the shadows. 3 people who shouldn't have been family by any rule the old world recognized stood together in the space they'd carved out of blood and stubbornness, and refusing to accept that some lives mattered less than others. Return to sender, the letter said. Home, they chose to call it. And in the end, maybe those meant the same thing after all.